Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for this important discussion on emerging threats to religious liberty from progressive policies. My name is Grace Melton, and on behalf of the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation, I would like to welcome and introduce our three panelists. First, we will hear from Mrs. Joy Madiba. Joy is an advocate of the High Court in Kenya, and she is currently the Executive Director of the East Africa Center for Law and Justice. She has traveled to the UN Human Rights Council on several occasions to speak against religious persecution, as well as to defend the rights of African families and people of faith. She's a passionate pro-life advocate, and she assists lawmakers with policy formulation and legislation in both the Kenyan National Assembly and the Senate. Next, we will hear from Tomas Enriquez. Tomas is the Advocacy Director for the OAS, Latin America, and the Caribbean at ADF International. He is a Chilean national and an attorney with an LLM in human rights law. Tomas previously served as the Chief Legal Officer for the Ministry of Education in Chile and was the founder and former Executive Director for Comunidad y Justicia, a Chilean organization dedicated to the defense of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Finally, we'll hear from Reverend Randall. The Reverend Dr. Bernard Randall joins us today from England. He is an Oxford University graduate in theology, former Director of Studies for Theology at the University of Cambridge, and former chaplain at Christ's College, Cambridge. As our speakers will illustrate for you today, there is a troubling trend that seems to be growing in many parts of the world, wherein the promotion of abortion and gender identity policies are resulting in the loss of religious liberty, free speech, and conscience protections, particularly for individuals and religious communities that profess traditional beliefs about the sanctity of human life, the definition of marriage, and the immutability of biological sex. As I have observed in my role monitoring the United Nations, various components of the UN system are involved in pushing this progressive ideology, especially even though the right to life and the freedom of religion is enshrined in international law. We also see governments at regional, national, and local levels increasingly targeting religious believers with legal or economic penalties when they offend the new woke orthodoxies. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Mrs. Joy Madiba to share her story with us.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's absolutely lovely to see all of you here. My name is Joy, as you have heard. I come from Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm very happy to be here today. Ironically, right now in Kenya, it's quite cold. So I think I'm the only person in the room who is so appreciative of all the heat and humidity. It's made me feel right at home. So let's get right into it. You'll please keep time for me? Thank you. I'm asking him to keep time because I am prone to speaking and speaking and speaking. And so I'll try and be mindful of Jared's indications. Now, ideological colonization. I don't know if you're familiar with this term. That's something that I want to explore a little bit before. So I come from Kenya, and this is a country that was once upon colonized by the British. And this colonization, what it does is people who feel like they're a little bit better than you come in and occupy your country, and they help you with a few of the things that you find problematic, like, healthcare and other things. But at the same time, they take the opportunity to help themselves to some of the things that you have in your territory and take them back home. So that was our history with colonization. So Africa, there's this big uprising, and in the 50s, we all get liberated from our colonizers, and we thought that that was the end of it. But what has happened now is fast forward where we are now, where we are seeing a different kind of engagement with the West. Now, I would like from the onset to say I'm communicating this with a lot of love and respect because I recognize I'm talking about most of your communities. So please don't take this offensively. Allow me to just communicate my truth. Don't see it as an attack. It's just a stating of what it is. And so people come into our societies and tell us, you know what? We've been looking at your healthcare policies and they're all very well and good, but you know what? We think we can help you to improve how you do it, and this is how you can do it. And so we find lobbyists and people who come in to sort of assist us in this situation. And so we find ourselves in a situation whereby we have a new kind of colonization, where you find there's one way of thinking, there's one way of communicating, there's one way of looking at things, and if you do things a little bit different, get a little slap on the wrist that tells you, that's not how it should be. Maybe you ought to do this in a different way. Religious liberty is one of those liberties that have been hard fought throughout humanity. Look at any civilization. When it comes to religion, people get very passionate about it. And the reason for this is because it's very subjective. You believe with all of you. And so when somebody tries to take that away, it becomes a little bit offensive. And what we have right now, let me talk about Kenya, is a situation where we have seen more and more attacks on our conscience rather than on things that are really a problem. So in the year 2010, Kenya was passing a new constitution. There was an agitation to pass a new constitution. And like I said earlier, we had people who were constitutional experts who came to help us to write a new constitution. And one of the things that we noticed was that a lot of the language that was used in our new constitution was very, for lack of a better word, UN language. Inclusive, accommodative, and all these vague terms that you really have to struggle to define. But what they do is that they create little pockets and little avenues for them to be expounded on. And this expounding on, you find mischief. So for example, Article 26 of our Constitution talks about the right to life. So it tells us, 1, you have a right to life. 2, life begins at conception and ends in natural death. Sounds good so far, right? Mm-hmm. Then 3, nobody can take away your right unless the law says so, to give room for death penalty, which we still have. And then it says 4, this is a curious one. Abortion is not permitted unless, in the opinion of a medical professional, the life or health of the mother is at risk, and therefore, in that situation, legislation can be passed to secure her life or health. You see where the problem is. So you've given this entire elaborate, very clear, succinct provision for life, but something is introduced that sort of leaves the leeway for legislation to be passed to allow for abortion for the sake of life or health. Now, what we had before is where the life of the mother was at stake, then an abortion could be permitted, even though it was generally zero policy on abortion. But now we had this little thing also called where her health was concerned. So we go to the WHO definition for health. Health is cultural, social, economic, psychological. Health is just as long as you're happy, you're healthy. If you're not happy, you're not healthy. And so we found ourselves in a situation where our very laws were being used to change the culture and the conscience. And so there was born a big pushback, hence something like the East Africa Center for Law and Justice. We started immediately after the Constitution was passed because we realized some of that activity had to be carried, the conversation had to be carried forward beyond the passing of the Constitution. This ideological colonization has found its way not just being pushed through legislation, but also being pushed through looking for the cultural change using legislative means. Now, in America, you understand this well, because you had the constitutional decision in Roe versus Wade that opened the door to abortion. So at the time when Roe v. Wade was passing, abortion was actually something that was quite reprehensible in the general American community. But because of the law changing, the culture was sort of changed to be in step with what had now become law. And now we are seeing that tactic now being applied to where I'm from, and which is why I guess I'm speaking with you today, because of the work that we're trying to do to push back against this. So early last year, we had I should have got the long term for it, but I forget, the ICPD 25. And they were trying to have a conversation about how to advance the agenda allow me to use it in its narrow sense, the gay agenda, and I hope you understand what I mean by that, to try and advance the gay agenda in African communities. There's an interesting thing about Kenya, and which makes it unique in this spectrum of colonization. South Africa is quite liberal, very liberal, in fact. In fact, it's more aligned to Europe and the Americas than the rest of Africa. But for some reason, their influence has not gone beyond their borders. The north of Africa, on the other hand, is very Islamic. And so there obviously lies the problem for this agenda. It's dead on arrival. The west of Africa has a mix. It has Islamic and Christian influences, but they're also bereft with very many problems, Boko Haram and all this and that. They're quite preoccupied with other things. The only place that is kind of open is East Africa. When you look at East Africa, Kenya sits in a position where it is surrounded by 6 other countries. So that means if something is available and accessible in Kenya, even if it is not legal or acceptable in the other countries, everybody can access Kenya easily by virtue of the East African community. We have free access in and out within the community. And so we become a place where a lot of emphasis has been put. We currently have a situation where there is, how do I put it? It's in concert. We are seeing a concert, an agreement of activity between Western governments, Western NGOs and other actors, as well as the United Nations. Now, why the United Nations is important in all this is because they're generally accepted to be working for the good of all. They're trying to advance human rights. They're not a particular society. They represent everybody. So we cannot say these are just American rights or these are this country's rights. This is everybody. So you find in Kenya, it's, I think, the only country in Africa that actually has a UN base. And so we get a lot of activity coming in because of being headquarters for UN Habitat and for UNEP, United Nations Environmental Programme. But now we have a lot of activity from the UNFPA, from UN Women, from UNICEF. So for example, on my telephone, I have messages directly sponsored by UNICEF trying to talk to me about vaccination of my children. So you find a situation where by acquiescence by the government, these foreign actors are able to work directly with the Kenyan populations because they allowed this access. Now, would this happen in another community where you're told, you know what, make sure you take your children for the measles jab? And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, why should I do that? The government is not telling me, it's UNICEF. When you go to the government, they tell you, oh yes, yes, we're aware about it, please collaborate. Ideological colonization is a threat to religious liberty because oftentimes you find a situation where, because of the power and the influence that they yield and they have with our legislators, they're able to, in most part, convince them that this is what is good for us. So one of the major problems with this is a lack of awareness of what this is. So we've been having a discussion about this before we came, and one of the things we have noticed is these days the language, one sentence means something totally different. And so people do not seem to understand when there is a danger. So for example, let me use a term like inclusivity. If I say inclusivity here, many people would take immediately it would go like wokeness. It is, a woke term. If you say inclusivity in Kenya, people think you want to include everybody. And so when they put this in legislation and they tell the legislators, look, we are looking for a more inclusive society, what they understand is that we are trying to get everybody at the table and everybody provided. They do not understand the difference in connotation. And so that makes our work difficult because sometimes you tell them that this thing is not good for us, but the people reading it are like, which part of it is not good? Look at it. There's nothing insidious about it. There's nothing hidden. It's all written down. Through the years, the suggestions have been very subtle. So the changes have not come in an avalanche. The changes have come with, one little law here, a little policy there, a little policy there, and eventually we find ourselves mired in this situation where the society has to change now to adopt with what is our new norm. So for example, once upon a time, if a woman wanted family planning services, she had to get it by herself. She had to go to an OBGYN and have a consultation about it and be able to be given the service. But now we're in a situation where, thanks to donations and to grants, we are able to get this for free in any government institution without any participation by a doctor. So if you just walk in and tell them, I want, in fact, this is literally what people say, I want family planning. So which one do you want? Do you forget to take pills every day? So we can't give you the pill, you'll forget to take the pill. So maybe we give you a 3-month injection. That's how casually the thing goes. Know how old are you? Did you come with your husband? There's no discussion around it. But this is something that is sanctioned and allowable. Because Jared has signaled me and I still have 2 pages, let me just skip to, it's not all doom and gloom. Let me skip to that bit. The rest we'll do in the Q&A. It's not all doom and gloom because, one, we are also getting woke. I'm talking about the conservative side, the pushback that they like calling us the pushback. We are getting aware of these things a little bit more often. So we're more vigilant. Every legislation, every policy that comes out, we are trying to keep up as much as possible. And so they're finding it harder and harder and harder to pass things under the table, and then we find out after they are passed, which I think is an excellent thing. Another thing, it has forced us to get organized. For a long time, the churches just used to issue threats. Oh, we'll organize our people to reject that. Oh, we will call our numbers to reject that. And of course, before long, they found ways of circumventing that. Now we are getting more organized. We are getting think tanks. We are putting more thought into it. And we are becoming proactive. We are not waiting for them to give us solutions. Now, in places where there are gaps. So, for example, we are working on a family protection law because we realize that abortion law clause in the Constitution, if it stays as is, eventually there will be legislation to give us abortion on demand. So we are working on a family protection law before that happens, so that we make provisions for everything early. Another thing it has also helped us is to collaborate. I looked at the program and I've realized that that is also the spirit here, where different like-minded groups are learning to work together. Before we were doing plenty of siloing, and you all do your own little thing in your little corners, but now we are learning the power of coming together. So I started talking about the ICPD 25. One of the ways we were able to torpedo that conference, it went on, and they made some declarations, but the impact was not as much, was because we got everybody from the Holy See to the embassies of friendly countries to ourselves, as well as NGOs and civic actors, and the pushback was strong and powerful to the extent that even our government had to agree that maybe they should have thought about it a little bit before they allowed the conference to go with the stature that it did. And finally, one of the things that Kenya has also been able to do is also start talking to the other countries and make them aware of what is going on. So a country like Uganda, where the proliferation is not as much, you'll find the President Museveni is a lot more outspoken about it because our president has kind of gotten compromised a little bit, and so sometimes he's hamstrung. But President Museveni will come out and speak very powerfully about it. Or the late Magufuli was also very good at speaking very powerfully against vaccination and other things. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that is my time, and I hope we collaborate a little bit more during the Q&A. God bless you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Grace, for the invitation. It's my pleasure and my privilege to be out here speaking at this conference. So with the theme of this panel being the threats of progressive policies to freedom of religion, I would start off with a disclaimer that the brunt of the work that I personally do with the rest of the team goes on in the Latin American context. And the interesting thing about the Latin American context is that we don't usually think that we have a freedom of religion problem. This is basically the case, I would argue, because for the most part of its modern history, or its history since the encounter of the coming to America of the Spaniards, Latin America has been for the most part a Christian continent, or in a very broad sense. But we haven't had issues with respect to prohibition of actually being able to worship freely. We don't have religious persecution in the sense that I think is very much in the minds of all of us who are here. People exposed to losing their lives, their livelihood, out of their desire, their duty to follow their conscience, to follow God in the way that they see fit. That doesn't usually happen in Latin America. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a problem with freedom of religion. It's just different. What I mean by that is fundamentally that, the free exercise of religion, in the sense that we would think about it here in the United States, is very much at stake. And one of the reasons why Latin America is today and in the near future a hotbed for cases having to do with freedom of religion has to do with the fact that the right itself, the content of this right, is underdeveloped. What I mean by that is that unlike the US, the prevalence of human rights discourse and the role that human rights treaties play around Latin America in general is very, very important. It's very pervasive. It's usually a part of the constitutional law of the majority of the countries that make up the region. And there's been a great development of different social rights, other political rights, civil rights, but religious freedom has not been developed. It's just there. There are few cases. It doesn't really come up ever so often. It never comes up in the context of not being able to worship freely, although I would say that because of what has happened during the pandemic, this has become an issue. And we, for instance, at ADF International, were involved in several cases around Latin America challenging the worship bans that were put in place. But now we see a new kind of case that is starting to come up, and it's starting to develop the jurisprudence, or it's going to develop the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Very important. We can talk more about it in the questions. And then also at the level of the different states. So I wanted to just highlight 3 different cases that we've been working on recently that touch directly on the ability of individuals to exercise what we could call some phases of religious freedom, and most fundamentally parental rights. I mean, the right of parents to be able to teach their children in accordance with their religious and moral convictions, as well as church autonomy. And church autonomy, I would say, is very much under attack, and I will tell you now why. So first and foremost, I would like to highlight the Pavés case. Some of you have already heard me talk about this. My friends and colleagues are probably tired of me talking about it, but it is a very important case that has been recently argued at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Fundamentally, Miss Sandra Pavés, was a Catholic religion teacher in a school in San Bernardo, Chile. Now, one particularity of Chile and many other countries not sharing the United States is that the presence of religious education in public schools or publicly funded schools is not unheard of. It's actually, I would say, quite common. There are rules in place. The Human Rights Committee at the United Nations has issued comments on how or when this is admissible. And so this takes place. Chile, I would argue, is also a model country in the sense that it allows for every religious denomination to be able to teach freely in schools if they register themselves with the state to do so. So Ms. Pavés was a Catholic religion teacher in this school. And she taught that class for many, many years, over 20 years, until 2007, when the Diocese of San Bernardo learned that she was involved in a same-sex relationship. And at that point in time, the Bishop of San Bernardo, following canon law as well as Chilean law, who in this particular aspect says that religious communities or religious denominations have the right to certify those who will teach on their behalf in religious education classes, spoke to Ms. Pavés and told her, we can no longer certify you as morally suitable to teach on our behalf, on behalf of the Catholic Church, because of the way that you choose to conduct your life. And she sued the church. She took them to court. She lost all the way to the Supreme Court, but decided to then take this case to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, suing the state of Chile, claiming that because of Chile's legislation, which is essentially the same as in many other countries, including Spain, and if I recall correctly, Austria, I think Italy, and many others that I don't recall right now, there was a human rights violation with respect to Ms. Pavés. The commission, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, 7 members agreed with her. They decided that this was a discrimination case. It was not relevant to them at all, the fact that she was, in fact, a Catholic religious education teacher. It's a confessional class, not just a class about history of religion or different religions, but it's Catholic education proper. But they didn't see any relevance to that fact whatsoever. And so they decided, in their view, that there had been a human rights violation, and they're asking the Inter-American Court to condemn Chile. The effect that this would have, not only with respect to Chile, but pretty much every other Latin American state that shares this decision to have or to allow for religious education in public schools, would be severe, to the point that it would probably push out religious education out of public schools. And not only that, because the commission said that the principle of non-discrimination, the way that they presented in this case, would reach also towards private relationships as well. So even if you had a private school, they're asking the court to decide that the sexual orientation, and not even the sexual orientation, because we defended that this was really about personal conduct. But if sexual orientation comes into play in whatever way, that should bar churches, religious communities from being able to declare or to decide that that person is no longer morally suitable to teach on their behalf. So obviously a big problem. The second case, or the second thing that I would like to highlight, has to do with the push for comprehensive sexuality education around Latin America. And this is not only a Latin American issue, this is an issue, I would say, everywhere. But in Latin America, we're starting to feel it or see it a bit more. Case in point, actually this week, we are helping allies in Chile go into the Constitutional Court in Chile, challenging a newly passed legislation that comprehensive rights of children's bill that would create a new subjective right of all children to receive comprehensive sexuality and effective education that is both secular and non-sexist. So they're forcing the idea that religious education has to be necessarily secular in the sense of not favoring or not taking into account religious beliefs. Obviously a huge issue, obviously I would say directly contrary to human rights and the letter of the law, in that all parents have a right to have their children educated in accordance with their moral and religious beliefs. Chile is not the only state where this is happening. This is being pushed, I would say, well, I know, in Belize, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Colombia, and many other places. What's going on in Chile right now is sort of a test study for us, because we thankfully got to go directly to the Constitutional Court, and we're making the argument that this goes directly against parental rights, that this is especially protected by human rights law, and this is a fundamental aspect of freedom of religion in terms of being able to educate your children in accordance with your moral and religious convictions. And finally, with the time that I have left, I would just wanted to highlight the case of the Diocese of Querétaro in Mexico. Now, there's two cases that are substantively the same here. And it involves having to do with progressive policies. There's been a wave of legislation having to do with the recognition of gender identity. But not curiously, I think obviously this is by design, but instead of recognizing or introducing the idea of gender identity as a legal category, what has happened in Latin America is that you end up replacing sex with gender. So it's not synonymous. Everybody recognizes there's a difference. But now your gender identity has a bearing over your sex, your legal sex, which was not dissociated. I mean, up until 5 years ago, what your sex read in your birth certificate and your ID was, corresponding with the material reality of your own existence. This is no longer the case. So now gender identity, instead of having created a different marker that would read out your gender identity, we actually just replace sex with whatever it is that the individual wants to proclaim for himself or herself. What's the problem here? Well, as it was foretold and warned by pretty much everyone that was involved in the discussion, this would have far-reaching repercussions with respect to third parties. And case in point, now we have litigation against the Catholic Church in both of these countries, because individuals that have legally changed their sex from male to female are now requesting and demanding that the Catholic Church change their baptismal certificates that were obviously registered the fact that they were born of the male or female sex, their former name, and by the way of claiming or demanding that they be changed, they create a big problem for the churches. It's not really about the registry, it's about what happens after that, because here's the document that proves what your constitutive identity is as a male or a female, with important effects for purposes of marriage, for purposes of other sacraments such as ordination. So the Catholic Church rightly is fighting for this, but the idea of a truce in which we live and let live is obviously to some extent an illusion, and we see it quite clearly in a case like this one, in which there is a demand for full control of what you would say is your the personal identity or persona that you have crafted for yourself and that you can impose on third parties, even with the force of the law. And we're seeing that today, and we at ADF International are helping out in all of these cases, fighting to preserve freedom of religion. So with that, I'll shut up and I'll just leave time for questions. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm Bernard, and I just want to start by saying a massive thank you to the Heritage Foundation for bringing me over here to share my story. And it's mostly a personal story that I'm going to be talking about, but their support it's one of those things where I felt at times I was a voice crying in the wilderness and under a lot of pressure, and they've taken a lot of that pressure off. They've made me feel that much better about why I'm here telling my story. I was, until recently, just an ordinary small town priest. Nothing very much, nothing very special, bumbling along with life, doing my ministry as best I could, as I'm sure priests around the world do. And then, well, I was chaplain in a school, a private school, a grade school, and the school 3 years ago introduced an organisation called Educate and Celebrate. And there are a number of these organisations in Britain, as I suspect there are in other places around the world. And their purpose is to prevent homophobic bullying and such like within schools. Well, that's what they say, and nobody could object to that. That's all absolutely fair enough. But actually, if you look at their description of their actions a little bit deeper, what this says, they want to embed gender identity and sexual orientation in the life of the school. And it seems to me that goes somewhat beyond just nobody should be discriminated against, nobody should be bullied for who they are. Those bits I would totally agree with. But that word, that expression, gender identity, there's something a bit more going on there. And indeed, the leader of this organisation came to the school and did some staff training. And she started off with the anti-bullying thing, and that was fine. But after a while, it moved into more discussion about what gender identity is, that we should be open to all these ideas. And then the bit that really, really struck me, during the staff training, she had a big screen up and doing various things, and she invited the staff to chant a sort of call and response bit at one point, and the thing that we were supposed to chant was the need to smash heteronormativity. Now, you may or may not know what heteronormativity is. It's the idea that human beings are male and female, and generally speaking form bonds of male and female for the purpose of having children and forming families, and that is just the normal state of affairs for the vast majority of the population. She wanted us to smash that situation. And if you know anything about queer theory, which is kind of an esoteric way of postmodern, somewhat neo-Marxist way of thinking, it's straight out of that school of thought. And so she was bringing this ideology into the school. And this was only the staff. In fairness, I don't know if the pupils ever heard that phrase, smash heteronormativity, but that was the purpose behind the whole programme that they wanted to institute. And I heard this, and it set alarm bells ringing in my mind. And I said to the senior leadership of the school, the anti-bullying stuff, brilliant. Yes, let's do as much of that as we can. But some of this other stuff is worrying. It doesn't fit well with a Christian understanding. Certainly the way I read the Bible, it's pretty heteronormative. We don't want to smash that. Thank you very much. In a Christian school, Church of England school. And the senior leadership said, yeah, no, absolutely right. We'll talk about this. We'll discuss which bits of the programme to adopt. A few months later, I discovered that without discussing it with me at all, they had adopted the entire programme. And I was not best pleased about that, but there was nothing much I could do. They made that very clear. That was decision made. But I picked up various bits and pieces from staff and pupils, just unease, uncertainty, confusion, and some disagreement with the programme. And then eventually one of the people said to me, please would you talk in chapel about why we're told we have to accept all this LGBT stuff in a Christian school. Have to accept. And that really struck me. So, because as chaplain, my job is to speak about faith and morals and spiritual matters, I said, yes, I'll talk about that. That's an important topic. And so in chapel, in a sermon, in a Christian act of worship, I said, Loving your neighbour as yourself means respecting your neighbour. And when we have disagreements, you never descend to personal attacks. You don't abuse the people you disagree with. But it doesn't mean you have to agree. And so, if you hear someone's ideology, you can listen to it and go, no, not for me. You can reject it. And that applies just as much to Christianity as to the LGBT agenda. And so I gave some examples of the kinds of things where sometimes it's difficult to agree and where respect for both sides is necessary. I said you may if you wish, not that you have to. If you wish, you may believe that marriage is properly only of a man and a woman. You may believe that biological sex is real and sometimes it makes a real difference. And you may look at the language of gender identity and think it's a bit incoherent, it doesn't really make sense, and therefore it can't be totally true. I thought that was moderate. I thought that was pretty liberal, and allowing pupils to make up their own minds, teaching them how to think and respect. But for saying these things, I was called into a meeting with senior leadership and basically interrogated, why have you said this? Why have you gone against our Educate and Celebrate programme? I was suspended, and ultimately I was fired for gross misconduct. Christian chaplain in a Christian school saying you may be Christian. But it's worse than that, because they also reported me to the police under the British government's anti-terrorism prevent scheme. I was reported as a potential terrorist, an extremist, someone who would draw pupils into violence. Fortunately, the police said straight away, there's no reason for this. There's nothing here that's a cause for concern. Though the police officer looking at it said, yes, but this is totally inappropriate in a school and inappropriate in society. Astonishing. And by the by, I was reported to Child Protection Services as a potential abuser. So that was a pretty low time. I was actually reinstated by the school's governors, the trustees, on appeal with a final written warning because I'd offended people so much. But then COVID came and I was put on furlough and eventually got rid of, made redundant, blaming financial reasons. It's fairly obvious it wasn't the finances that made them get rid of me. And in that time, after I was reinstated, before COVID, my sermons were censored. I wasn't allowed to say what I wanted to say. I wasn't allowed to teach and be with the pupils in the classroom. And now I'm taking legal action against the school. So the Christian chaplain of a Christian school who said Christian things in a Christian act of worship is suing the school for religious discrimination. Go figure, I think, as my American cousins would say. And I'd like to say a massive thank you also to the organisation in Britain called Christian Concern. And they've given me the cards which are on your seat and the magazines are at the back. They deal with dozens of reports a month, hundreds a year of people just asking for advice, seeking legal help with this kind of problem. And my case is perhaps the most extreme that we've found, but there are plenty of them going on in the UK. And I think what comes out of this is, well, I'm normally suspicious of slippery slope arguments. They're not always true. But look 10 years down the line, down that slippery slope, if we don't stop the extremeness of the LGBT activists, this is the kind of thing that will be happening. Moderate people reported as potential terrorists. That's the astonishing thing about it. So I've had a lot of time to think about these things. I haven't been able to minister in any shape or form for over a year because of the way that things have worked out. So I've had time to think. Seems to me that in the West, if we don't value religious freedom, then we're losing something really fundamentally important. But also, if we don't in the West model religious freedom, real religious freedom that actually matters and is tangible to everybody, we can hardly go to the non-Western countries and say, oh, religious freedom is a good thing. Because they'll look at us and they'll say, really? Look me in the eye and say that. Because I've heard about Bernard Randall and I've heard about all these other cases, and it doesn't look as if you believe in religious freedom. Why are you trying to sell it to us? So this is the kind of thing I think that matters for everyone internationally. And that's where I'll leave it for the Q&A.
Well, thank you all for those really powerful comments. I'd like to just ask sort of first open-ended question. Okay, I'm sorry. Just thank you all for your comments. Is it working now? Well, I was just hoping that you could all speak a little bit more to sort of broadly what the way forward is. How and where can we best defend universal human rights to religious freedom and to conscience protections, especially when they come into conflict with Western or progressive policy priorities like we see in some of the cases we discussed today. Does anyone want to take that first?
Oh, that's hard.
Joy's ready.
I want you, Joy.
I think one thing that we can admit is that with the world becoming a global village, we inevitably influence each other's cultures. That's something that is a given. And we also influence each other's reactions, legislation. We borrow a lot from each other. So I think the problem has been there's no balance. The liberal agenda is very organized, is very aggressive, is very progressive, but the conservative side is a little bit more mellow. If there was, let me say, for lack of a better word, if there was a balance in the process, there might be a counterweight such that one is able to not just hear one side of the story all the time because if a lie is repeated often enough, eventually it starts sounding like the truth. But if somebody says, yes, there's that, but there's also this, give us options, give us something to work with. I'm talking now in terms of we as being influenced, because we only get to hear one side a lot. The other thing I would say as well is a little bit of oversight between the countries would also help. So like from my experience, I have found that many times when I talk to my friends in the West, they're quite oblivious to how their foreign policy affects legislation in a country like mine. It's something almost of an epiphany. They're like, does that really happen? And it does. Just asking some questions from your legislators, your congressmen, your senators, just find out, okay, fine. So foreign policy says this. So for example, the Mexican city policy that had said you cannot use federal funds to advance abortion agenda overseas. Now that has been taken away. So, okay, fine, so it's been taken away, but how much of American money is going to push abortion? Look at it versus how much is going into school feeding programs or into other, like the COVAX thing that is now big right now. Because sometimes when we just have somebody from the same side as, for lack of a better word, the agenda people, asking the questions, because of the mutual respect, they tend to respond better than if it's just the Africans always asking. Because, you know, you look like you need the help. Why are you being fussy? Why are you being choosy? You know, take the help or keep suffering. So maybe that would be a place where we could start.
Sure. Well, I mean, yeah, just to follow up and to support what Joy was saying, she's absolutely right in the sense that there's so much that goes on at the diplomatic level, the international level, what gets negotiated there, what gets pushed over there, and the effect that it has all around the world, to which many people, for the most part, are oblivious. I would say that us, as an institution, have confidence in courts of law and in our ability to still fight for freedom in the courts of law, which is why we keep doing it. But it really requires also individual courage from individuals to be willing to stand up for what they know to be right and for their convictions, and to, you know, fight to have that day in court. And I think that's so admirable about Bernard, in the sense of, you know, being able to stand up for what you believe in. We don't see that from everybody else, and I understand why. I'm not passing judgment. I mean, it's hard to stand up to the wave of progressive ideology that is very aggressive and in many respects, of course. others. It's hard, we know this, but we also need to have show that individual courage, I think.
I think for me, and I've had to think about this quite a lot over the last couple of years, when you look at the LGBT ideology, you say, well, this is actually a religion. This is actually functioning in every possible sense, certainly every legal sense, as a religion. And if we can get it recognised as a religion, that's going to sound slightly contradictory, but it means that it's on an equal footing with all other religious ideas. It can't say, oh, these are fundamental rights that are more important, even though those are not directly in any human rights declaration. It has to compete at the same level as every other religion rather than trying to take precedence. And I think that protects everybody. It protects the people for whom these are important rights, but it also protects people in the traditional religions, as it were, who can then say, yes, but your ideas don't trump my ideas. They have to live together. And we have to model that living together. And I think having these ideas sort of legally declared religious, or in Britain just being a philosophical belief, gets the same level of protection. I think that's the way forward, it seems to me. Everybody wins from that. And that's actually what we want to do. We don't want to fight a culture war, because nobody ends up winning. We want everybody to come away from this better and happier. So that would be my approach.
Well, before I turn it over to audience questions, I just wanted to ask perhaps a leading question, but what do you all say to those who would argue that rights are all interconnected and interdependent? And is religious freedom a particularly important right, or is it more important than others? I say this in the context of us all being here at the International Religious Freedom Summit.
Well, it's quite important. It seems to me that religious freedom is a canary in the coal mine. I don't know if you're familiar with that idea, that it tells you what's going on in a society. If religion is free, probably everything else is free too. If you start restricting religion, because religious people like to speak the truth as best they understand it, and if you restrict truth speaking, don't think you have a healthy society, and you only need to look at any totalitarian regime where truth is restricted. So it's not that it is more important, but it signifies the importance placed on those rights.
I talked about how we were changing our constitution and we got all this help writing it. One of the things that was very curious about what happened when we were writing our constitution was previously we had a constitution that gave us the liberty to right to freedom, to worship alone and with others, in public or in private. And we had the right to propagate our religion. We had the right to evangelize and to convince people to join the religion without infringing on any other rights. And that was actually protected. Evangelism and spreading religion was protected. Then when we passed our new constitution, something very curious happened. We were given the right to worship alone and with others, in public or in private, full stop. And one thing that was even more curious is that the part B of that article said that you could not discriminate on the basis of religion if you are going to run a hospital, a school, or a university. Any institution that is fully sponsored by the church or religious organization, not church, any religious organization cannot discriminate in their institutions on the basis of religion, which is preposterous. In the context of what you're asking, this is the need to say that religion cannot be used by religious people as a basis of excluding others is primarily because in this agenda, the only ideas that really challenge the agenda are religious ideas. And so if you get yourself into a space where religious people are unable to articulate their religious beliefs in direct contradiction to these other ideas, then you've got nothing else challenging the agenda. Freedom of conscience has to be, as Bernard has correctly put, free for everybody. But if you tell religious people, you go ahead and believe what you believe, but don't tell anybody else about it. Don't even tell your own children. And if you try to do that, then we will cite you for discrimination, we will cite you for hate speech, we'll cite you for this. Then you take away something that is really fundamental. So in answer to your question, I think of all the rights and all the freedoms that people have, freedom of religion gives them a conscience. It gives them a true north. It gives them bearing. Take that away, then people become suggestible. They become malleable. And the agenda then can be sold a lot easier. So I think that's why there's such a huge impact. If we erode religious freedom, probably it's forgive me for being melodramatic, it's the breakdown of society as we know it.
Thank you. Well, are there any questions in the audience? You want to? Jared will come around with a microphone. You want to start over here, Jared?
Robbie, whoa, how do I turn it down? Or they're turning it down for me. I'm Rabbi Yaakov Menken, Coalition for Jewish Values. I'm obviously here in the United States, as you can probably hear. And this is for Father Bernard. I think, actually, for the moderator's question about, what do we do to move forward? As far as standing with you, I'm sure you're aware that there are entire school systems that have faced in Britain from Ofsted the same problem, the forcing the curriculum upon a school. For example, a elementary girls' school that teaches nothing about sexuality, doesn't touch the topic, and all of a sudden they're being told you have to talk about multiple sexualities. That entire concept is offensive before you even get to getting rid of, what was it called? Heteronormativity. Yeah. Yes, even before you get there. So, and I can introduce you to a fine Rav in Manchester who would be a witness for you in your legal pursuit. I mean, I think we have about a 2,000-year-old difference of opinion. Just small details. And so we obviously have the ability to live together despite profound ideological differences. And I also really loved your concept, and I wanted to ask you about that, your concept of recognizing LGBTQ as its own religion. Yes. And boxing them in that way. Because I came up with exactly the same idea in relevance to some things domestically, and I was told that it's giving them too much recognition. And I happen to share your opinion. I think, unfortunately, the cow is out of the barn. You can't tell them that there's no legitimacy or not as much. You have to prevent it from taking over. And so I wanted to ask you if you'd addressed that argument at all. How do you deal with people saying to you, how dare you give that much recognition that you're actually calling it a religion?
Yeah, I think, I'm not working at the moment, so I'm planning to write a book addressing this or see what I can manage to write anyway, addressing this and exploring it in more detail. But it does seem to me to be the way to go. I don't think you can turn back the clock and do anything different. For example, we see, particularly on social media, we see people being mobbed for having the wrong opinion. It seems to me that Christianity, and I suspect Judaism too, gave up on heresy trials a long time ago, but the woke still think it's a really good idea. So actually, if you want progressives, look at traditional religions which gave up on these things. If you want regressive, retrograde, then look at the woke with their rather medieval attitude to heresy. And I think we need to make those points and make the moderate liberal left rather uncomfortable being associated with an extremist, as it were, religious ideology. I think that's my view anyway.
Hi, Ellen Fantini from Aid to the Church in Need. I guess following up on the question that was just asked, I'm wondering about experiences the panelists may have had with creating, let's say, unusual alliances. I know Heritage did so relating to the Equality Act and inviting radical feminists to talk about what their view on this gender ideology stuff is. And I think about, in the UK, I think about Maya Forstetter, who just prevailed in her employment tribunal appeal. But I'm thinking about unusual alliances where you can come together at least on some of these issues, if not all of them, and what your experiences have been with that.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I don't resort to rocket science in this. I think it really starts from just the willingness to enter into dialogue and recognize that we either stand together or fall apart. It's funny that you would ask this, because very recently, apropos of the Profess case that I was mentioning, we actually had that fantastic coalition, unheard of before, of every major religious group in Chile coming together to sign the same amicus brief to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and letting them know that they were standing together to defend their right to see who would teach their faith to their children on their behalf. And there wasn't anything special in the way that happened, other than just having that willingness to talk, to find common ground, and to especially realize that the way things are going nowadays in our world, we need to stand together. So that's my answer to that question.
In Kenya, we recently just defeated a reproductive health bill, and how we were able to do it is in the same way that Tomas is talking about, where we found ourselves having to work with all people of faith. So where before, like for example, you didn't find the Christians working with the Muslims or other religious groups, we found ourselves working together with Christians and the Christians now being the entire spectrum of Catholic, the Protestants, the evangelicals, and everybody coming together, and the Muslims and indigenous African traditional faiths, because we realized that it is an attack on the family, and all religions were agreed that family needed to be protected. We hadn't done that before, and this has taken us to an even bigger level, where we are having professional organizations being started across faiths. So we have the Kenya Christian Professional Forum, whereas before it would be the Kenya Catholic lawyers, Kenya Catholic doctors, Kenya Catholic this, but now we are calling them Christian organizations, and everybody is being allowed to come in. So it has forced the people of faith to start working together, because we realized now we are working on the one against comprehensive sexuality education for the same reason, that if it is allowed against one Christian institution, eventually it will permeate into all of them. So yes, we are finding ourselves having very new bedfellows, but it's working for us right now, yes.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. We need to give up the room, but thank you all for coming, and I think the panelists will be around for a little while after if you want to catch them in the hall, and thanks for your attention.